The sun was setting over Westfield, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Officer James Mercer sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He'd been on duty for almost 10 hours, and his mood was getting worse, by the minute. It had been a long week of what he considered pointless traffic stops and paperwork. His radio crackled with occasional updates from dispatch, but it had been a quiet evening so far. That's when he spotted the silver sedan rolling through a stop sign. It wasn't a complete violation. The car had slowed down significantly, but technically, the driver hadn't made a complete stop. Mercer flipped on his lights and pulled out behind the vehicle. Inside the silver car, 19-year-old Zoe Bennett was listening to music, heading home after finishing her shift at the local bookstore. Her phone buzzed with a text from her dad asking if she would be home for dinner. She had just placed her phone down when she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A wave of anxiety washed over her as she carefully pulled over to the curb, trying to remember if she had done anything wrong. Great, she whispered to herself, turning down the music and reaching for her wallet in her purse. Her hands trembled slightly as she retrieved her driver's license. As the daughter of Mayor Robert Bennett, Westfield's first black mayor, Zoe had been taught to be extra careful during police interactions. Stay calm, be polite, keep your hands visible. Her father's words echoed in her head. Officer Mercer took his time exiting his vehicle. He radioed in the license plate number and walked slowly toward Zoe's car. His hand rested casually on his holstered weapon, a habit he'd developed over his 15 years on the force. The computer in his patrol car had already shown that the car was registered to the Bennett family, but Mercer hadn't made the connection to the mayor yet. License and registration, Mercer demanded, leaning down to peer through the window. The interior light illuminated Zoe's face, and recognition flickered across Mercer's features. His expression hardened. "Of course, officer," Zoe replied, handing over her documents with a steady hand despite her racing heart. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Mercer scanned her license, his jaw tightening when he saw the last name, Bennett. "You ran that stop sign back there," he said flatly. "I'm sorry, but I'm certain I stopped," Zoe replied, trying to keep her voice even. "I always stop at that intersection." Mercer's face flushed. "Are you saying I'm lying?" His voice rose slightly. "Step out of the vehicle." Confused and increasingly frightened, Zoe asked, "Officer, have I done something wrong? I was just heading home from work." "I said get out of the car." Mercer's voice was loud now, echoing down the quiet street. A couple walking their dog on the opposite sidewalk stopped to watch. Zoe's heart pounded in her chest. She knew her rights, but she also knew situations like this could turn dangerous quickly. "I'd like to know why I need to exit my vehicle for a stop sign violation," she said, keeping her voice calm but firm. "I've provided my license and registration as requested." Something in Mercer snapped. The stress of the week, his long-standing resentment of Mayor Bennett's police reform initiatives and now being questioned by the mayor's daughter, it all boiled over in an instant of rage. "You think you're special because of who your daddy is?" Mercer growled, reaching for his weapon. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you." The couple across the street froze in shock. The woman pulled out her phone and began recording. In one fluid motion, Mercer drew his gun and pointed it directly at Zoe. "Get out of the car now," he shouted, using a racial slur that made the witnesses gasp. Time seemed to slow down for Zoe. She could see the barrel of the gun pointed at her face, could feel her heart threatening to burst from her chest. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone on the passenger seat. "Don't you dare move," Mercer shouted, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. "I'm just turning on my camera," Zoe explained, her voice remarkably steady despite her fear. "For both our protection, officer." As Zoe activated her phone's camera, the reality of what was happening seemed to penetrate Mercer's anger. His body camera was recording everything. His words, his actions, the gun pointed at an unarmed young woman who had committed, at most, a minor traffic violation. But it was too late to back down now. "You think that camera will save you? You're Father can't protect you from the law. The law doesn't include pointing guns at people for minor traffic stops, Zoe replied, somehow finding courage despite her terror. Please lower your weapon, officer. Across the street, more neighbors had gathered. Several had phones out recording the incident. One was on the phone with 911, reporting an officer behaving erratically. She's not complying with orders, Mercer shouted to the gathering crowd, aware he was losing control of the situation. His hand shook slightly, the gun still aimed at Zoe. In that moment, Zoe made a decision. Moving very slowly, she placed both hands on the steering wheel where they were clearly visible. Officer Mercer, she said, reading his name tag, I am not a threat to you. I'm a college student on my way home from work. There are multiple witnesses and cameras recording this interaction. Please lower your weapon and we can discuss the traffic violation professionally. The calmness of her response seemed to reach something in Mercer. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the crowd of witnesses. The multiple cameras pointed his way. His arm lowered slightly, but the damage was done. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Another patrol car was pulling up behind Mercer's vehicle. Officer Tom Chen, responding to the 911 call about an officer with a drawn weapon at a traffic stop, stepped out of his car with caution. Mercer, what's going on here? Chen called out, his hand hovering near his own weapon, unsure of the situation. Reality crashed back over Mercer like a cold wave. He lowered his gun completely, blinking as if waking from a trance. This driver was being uncooperative, he said, but the fight had gone out of his voice. I have the whole thing on video, Zoe called to Officer Chen, her phone still recording. He pulled a gun on me for questioning why I was stopped. Chen approached carefully, taking in the scene. The terrified young woman, the gathered witnesses with their phones, and his colleague looking increasingly unstable. Mercer, holster your weapon, Chen said firmly. When Mercer complied, Chen turned to Zoe. Are you all right, miss? No, I'm not, Zoe answered truthfully, tears finally breaking through her composed facade. He threatened me and used racial slurs. I did nothing to deserve this. As Chen radioed for a supervisor, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in for everyone involved. For Zoe, the terrifying knowledge that a routine drive home could have ended her life. For the witnesses, the shocking display of abuse of power happening in their quiet neighborhood. And for Officer Mercer, though he didn't realize it yet, the beginning of the end of his career and freedom. What none of them knew in that moment was how this single traffic stop would ignite a reckoning throughout Westfield, one that would expose deep-rooted issues within the police department, test the leadership of Mayor Bennett, and ultimately lead to Officer James Mercer facing the consequences of not just this night, but years of unchecked behavior. As more police cars arrived and the blue lights flashed against the darkening sky, Zoe finally let herself cry, the phone still recording in her trembling hand, documenting every second of the night that would change everything. News travels fast in small cities. By midnight, video clips of Officer Mercer pointing his gun at Zoe Bennett were already spreading across social media. By sunrise, nearly everyone in Westfield had either seen the footage or heard about the incident. The raw emotion captured. In those videos, Zoe's terror, Mercer's rage, the shocked voices of witnesses, sparked immediate outrage throughout the community. Mayor Robert Bennett was in the middle of a late dinner with city officials when his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. When he finally checked it and saw the flood of messages about his daughter, his heart nearly stopped. He excused himself, hands shaking as he called Zoe, who was still at the police station giving her statement. Dad, I'm okay, were her first words, though her voice trembled. Despite the personal nightmare unfolding for his family, Mayor Bennett knew he needed to respond as both a father and a leader. After making sure Zoe was safe with her mother, he arrived at his office just after midnight, his face a mask of carefully controlled emotion as he faced the gathering press. As mayor of Westfield, I am deeply disturbed by the video evidence showing one of our officers drawing a weapon on an unarmed citizen during a routine traffic stop, he said, the cameras capturing the slight tremor in his hands. As Zoe Bennett's father, he paused, struggling for composure. I am thankful she is physically unharmed. I am requesting a complete and transparent investigation into this incident, and I will recuse myself from any decisions related to this case to avoid any conflict of interest. What he didn't say publicly was how he'd warned Zoe countless times about being careful around police, how he'd taught her what to do if she was ever stopped, how despite all his power as mayor, he couldn't protect his own daughter from having a gun pointed at her face. Across town at the police station, Chief Patricia Wilson was reviewing the body camera footage in her office, her face growing grimmer with each passing second. The footage was even worse than the cell phone videos circulating online. The racial slurs, the unnecessary escalation, the clear abuse of power. There was no defending Mercer's actions. "This is a disaster," she muttered, rubbing her temples. Deputy Chief Rivera stood by the window, watching as a small group of protesters had already gathered outside despite the late hour. "It's going to get much worse," he said. "People are angry, Pat, and they should be." Chief Wilson nodded, reaching for the phone. "Place Mercer on administrative leave immediately. Full suspension, no pay, pending investigation, and get internal affairs in here first thing tomorrow." By morning, the crowd outside the police station had grown from dozens to hundreds. People of all ages and backgrounds stood together holding signs demanding justice for Zoe and no guns for traffic stops. Local news vans lined the street, reporters doing live updates with the growing protest as their backdrop. Lisa Chen, a longtime resident and local business owner, hadn't planned on attending the protest, but after seeing the footage, she couldn't stay away. "That could have been my daughter," she told a reporter, tears in her eyes. "That could have been anyone's child." Inside the station, the internal affairs team led by Captain Dawson had been working since dawn. What started as an investigation into a single incident quickly expanded as they began pulling Mercer's personnel file. "There's something off here," Dawson said, flipping through the thin folder. 15 years on the force and barely any complaints? That doesn't add up with what we saw on that video. His team began digging deeper, interviewing other officers, dispatchers, and administrative staff. By mid-afternoon, a troubling pattern emerged. There had been complaints against Mercer, lots of them, but most had mysteriously disappeared or been dismissed without proper investigation. Maria Lopez, a records clerk who had worked at the department for 20 years, finally spoke up. The previous chief would make things go away for certain officers, she admitted, looking nervously at her hands. Mercer was one of his favorites. With this new information, Dawson's team began tracking down people who had filed complaints. The stories were disturbingly similar: aggressive behavior, racial profiling, excessive force, particularly with people of color. William Thompson, a black business owner, described being slammed against his car during a traffic stop 3 years earlier. "When I tried to file a complaint, they told me it would be handled. I never heard anything back. After a while, you just stop expecting justice." At City Hall, the mayor's staff was working to address the growing crisis. Mayor Bennett had been meeting with community leaders all day, listening to their concerns and anger. Though exhausted and personally devastated, he maintained his focus on finding a path forward for the city. "We need immediate action," said Reverend Jackson from First Baptist Church. "Not just about Mercer, but about the whole system that protected him." The mayor nodded, taking notes. "I agree. This isn't just about one bad officer. It's about a culture that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked." By evening, the protest had swelled to fill the entire block around the police station. It remained peaceful but determined, with speakers sharing their own experiences with police bias. Zoe's friends from college had organized a candlelight vigil to take place that night, and people were already gathering with candles and flowers. Eddie? The Bennett home. Zoe sat curled up on the couch, her mother's arm around her shoulders as they watched the news coverage. She hadn't slept much, the image of the gun pointed at her face replaying whenever she closed her eyes. "All those people," she whispered, seeing the size of the protest. "I never wanted to cause all this." Her mother squeezed her shoulder. "You didn't cause anything, honey. Mercer did this, and the system that protected him all these years." Zoe's phone had been flooded with messages. Friends checking on her, strangers offering support, and inevitably, some hateful comments blaming her for what happened. She had turned it off hours ago, feeling overwhelmed by the attention. "Dad wants me to speak at a press conference tomorrow," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can." "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," her mother assured her. Zoe stared at the television, watching as more people joined the vigil. "But if I don't speak up, who will? There are so many people who go through worse than I did, who never get justice or attention." Across town, Officer James Mercer sat alone in his apartment, blinds drawn against the reporters who had discovered where he lived. His phone had been confiscated as part of the investigation, his gun and badge taken. His union representative had called to say they couldn't defend him given the clear video evidence, and suggested he start looking for a lawyer. The gravity of what he had done was finally sinking in. In a moment of rage, he had destroyed his career, endangered a young woman's life, and exposed his own prejudices to the world. There would be no coming back from this. At the police station, Chief Wilson called an emergency meeting with all officers. The room was tense, many avoiding eye contact with her or each other. "Let me be perfectly clear," she began, her voice firm. "What happened last night is inexcusable and indefensible, but it didn't happen in isolation. Some of you knew Mercer had issues, some of you saw warning signs, and no one said anything." Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "That ends today," she continued. "Internal Affairs is reopening every complaint ever filed against Mercer, and they're looking for patterns throughout the department. If you've witnessed misconduct and stayed silent, now is the time to come forward." Officer Chen, who had responded to the scene the night before, raised his hand. "Chief, some of us tried to report problems before. Nothing ever happened." Wilson nodded grimly. "I know. The system failed. But that's no excuse for us to keep failing. Starting tomorrow, we're implementing new oversight procedures, and I'm requesting an external review of our entire department." As night fell over Westfield, the community remained divided yet united in unexpected ways. The candlelight vigil had grown to include people who had never attended a protest before. Old divisions between neighborhoods, between races, between the police and the policed seemed less important in the face of such a clear injustice. At the edge of the crowd, an older white couple stood holding candles. They had lived in Westfield their entire lives and had always supported the police without question. "I never thought I'd be out here like this," the husband admitted to a young black woman standing nearby. "But I saw that video. No one deserves to have a gun pulled on them for a traffic stop. No one." The woman nodded, surprised by his words. "Thank you for being here," she said simply. As thousands of candles illuminated the darkness, a fragile hope began to take shape. That perhaps from this terrible incident, real change might finally come to Westfield. That the hidden patterns of bias and abuse might finally be exposed and addressed. That Zoe's terrifying experience might somehow lead to justice, not just for her, but for everyone who had suffered in silence before her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The official investigation, the media frenzy, the political pressures, but tonight at least the community stood together, bearing witness to a truth that could no longer be denied or buried. The police headquarters became a hive of activity in the days following the incident. Captain Dawson's Internal Affairs team had taken over a conference room, the walls now covered with timeline charts, witness statements, and photographs. 3 days into the investigation, they received access to Officer Mercer's phone records and devices, seized as evidence in the growing case against him. Digital forensics specialist Tanya Powell sat hunched over her computer, methodically going through the contents of Mercer's phone. She'd been at it for hours when something caught her eye. "Captain, you need to see this," she called across the room, her voice tight. Dawson walked over, coffee in hand. "What have you got?" Tanya pointed to her screen. "Text messages between Mercer and some of his friends. They're bad, sir." Dawson leaned in, reading the exchange. His face darkened as he scrolled through message after message, filled with racial slurs and hateful rhetoric. "Print all of this," he ordered, "and keep digging." By the end of the day, they had uncovered hundreds of text messages spanning years. The most damning were those specifically targeting Mayor Bennett and his family. In one exchange from 6 months earlier, Mercer had written, "Bennett thinks he can reform us. I'd like to see him try when we patrol his neighborhood. Maybe we should pay his family a special visit." When shown the messages, Chief Wilson closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the blow. "This isn't just bias," she said quietly. "This is hatred, and it's been hiding in plain sight." The next phase of the investigation involved interviewing other officers who had worked with Mercer over the years. Most were reluctant to speak at first, bound by the unwritten code that protected their own. But as the evidence against Mercer mounted, cracks began to appear in the wall of silence. Officer Diane Reynolds, a 10-year veteran, was the first to come forward voluntarily. "I should have said something years ago," she admitted. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The things he would say when no supervisors were around. "I told myself it was just talk." "Can you give us specific examples?" Captain Dawson asked. Reynolds nodded, her discomfort visible. After traffic stops with minority drivers, he'd make comments about teaching them their place. He called black neighborhoods zoo patrol. When Mayor Bennett was elected, Mercer said it was the worst day in Westfield history. "And you never reported this." "Behavior?" Reynolds looked away. "Once, 5 years ago, I filed a formal complaint after he refused to respond to a domestic violence call in a predominantly black neighborhood, saying they should just let them handle it themselves. Nothing ever happened with my report. It just disappeared." Similar accounts began emerging from other officers, dispatchers, and even janitors who had overheard Mercer's comments in the locker room or break area. A picture formed of a man whose racist views had been an open secret within the department for years, tolerated and sometimes even quietly supported by previous leadership. At the district attorney's office, Helen Parker watched the evidence pile up with growing certainty that this case needed to be prosecuted to the fullest extent. As the city's first black district attorney, she felt the weight of the moment but was determined to remain objective and thorough. "The evidence is clear," she told her team during a strategy meeting. "This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was the culmination of years of bigotry, finally captured on camera." Her assistant, Luis Ortiz, nodded. "The gun charge is straightforward, but we should also pursue the hate crime enhancement. Those text messages give us clear evidence of racial motivation." Parker considered this. "The defense will argue that text messages don't prove his state of mind during the traffic stop. Except we have him on body cam using the same language that appears in his texts," Luis pointed out. "And now we have multiple officers confirming this was his normal behavior." The decision didn't come lightly, but after reviewing all available evidence, Parker announced charges against Mercer: assault with a deadly weapon, intimidation based on racial bias, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority. If convicted, on all counts, Mercer could face up to 15 years in prison. The announcement of charges sent ripples through Westfield. For many in the community, particularly people of color who had experienced harassment from police, it represented a moment of validation they never expected to see. "I've lived here my whole life," said 68-year-old Harold Washington, speaking at a community forum. "Never thought I'd see the day when a police officer would actually face consequences for treating us this way." For others, particularly those with connections to law enforcement, the charges seemed excessive. Small counter-protests formed, with participants holding signs reading "Support our police" and "One mistake shouldn't end a career." Retired Officer Frank Miller became a regular on local news, defending Mercer. "Look, what he did was wrong, no question. But 15 years for pointing a gun? Officers make split-second decisions under pressure every day." These divisions played out in neighborhood barbecues, church gatherings, and school board meetings across Westfield. The case had touched a nerve, forcing conversations about race and policing that many had avoided for decades. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to expand beyond Mercer himself. Internal Affairs began reviewing every complaint filed against the department in the past decade, looking for patterns of bias and misconduct. They discovered dozens of cases where minority citizens had reported treatment, similar to what Zoe experienced only to have their complaints dismissed or buried. This is institutional failure, Chief Wilson acknowledged during a press conference. Officer Mercer didn't develop these attitudes in a vacuum, and he wasn't able to act on them without systemic problems enabling him. The FBI opened its own investigation into the department, focusing on potential civil rights violations. Agents interviewed former officers, reviewed decades of records, and examined hiring and discipline patterns throughout the department's history. For Mayor Bennett, balancing his roles as city leader and Zoe's father proved increasingly difficult. He had recused himself from direct involvement in the case but continued working on broader police reform initiatives. At home, he watched his daughter struggle with the aftermath of trauma, jumping at sudden noises and having nightmares about guns pointed at her face. "I just want things to go back to normal," Zoe confided to her counselor during a therapy session. "But I don't even know what normal is anymore." Her story had become a rallying cry, her face appearing on t-shirts and protest signs. Strangers approached her in public to express support or ask for selfies. Some hailed her as a hero for standing up to Mercer that night, though she never felt like one. Others, particularly online, accused her of exaggerating the incident for attention or political gain. "I never wanted any of this," she told her friends. "I just wanted to drive home from work without having a gun in my face." 6 weeks into the investigation, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former police administrator named Grace Kelly contacted Internal Affairs with information she had been holding on to for years. "I worked in records from 2010 to 2018, she explained to Captain Dawson. The previous chief had a system for certain officers, Mercer, and about 5 others. Their complaint files were marked with a special code, and I was instructed to route them directly to the chief's office instead of following normal procedure." "And what happened to these complaints?" Dawson asked. "They were altered or destroyed." Grace said, "I saw it happen. When citizens followed up, they were told investigations found no evidence of wrongdoing, but there never was any real investigation. This testimony provided the missing link between individual incidents and the systemic failures that allowed Mercer to remain on the force despite his behavior. It also implicated former leadership in a cover-up that had endangered the community for years. As the case against Mercer strengthened, his legal team began exploring plea options. The evidence was overwhelming. Body camera footage, cell phone videos from witnesses, text messages revealing his racist attitudes, and now testimony from his own colleagues confirming his history of misconduct. "They're offering 12 years, if you plead guilty to all charges," his lawyer explained during a jailhouse meeting. Mercer, who had lost weight during his time in custody, shook his head. 12 years for pulling my weapon? Officers draw their guns every day." "James, this isn't just about drawing your weapon. The racial component, the text messages, your history, the DA has a very strong case, and public opinion is solidly against you." "Public opinion?" Mercer scoffed. "You mean the media circus whipped up by Bennett to advance his anti-police agenda?" His lawyer sighed, closing his notepad. "The jury pool will come from this community, the same community that's been protesting outside the station for weeks. Think about that before you dismiss any plea offers." As summer turned to fall, the investigation wrapped up and preparations for trial began. The case had transformed Westfield, exposing decades of buried tensions and forcing the community to confront uncomfortable truths about its institutions. Whatever the outcome of Mercer's trial, it was clear that nothing in Westfield would ever be quite the same again. The question now was whether these painful revelations would lead to meaningful change, or whether old patterns would reassert themselves once the media spotlight moved on. For those most affected, Zoe, her family, and countless others who had experienced similar treatment without cameras present, that question remained painfully open. The Westfield County Courthouse stood like a stone giant in the center of town, its grand steps now crowded with news vans, reporters, and citizens hoping to witness history. It was the first day of Officer James Mercer's trial, and the line to get inside stretched around the block despite the autumn chill. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension as attorneys made final preparations. The prosecution table was headed by District Attorney Helen Parker, flanked by her team of assistants. Across the aisle, Mercer sat with his defense attorney, Richard Collins, a former prosecutor known for taking on difficult cases. Mercer had lost weight during his time in pretrial detention, his uniform replaced by a Navy suit that seemed too big for his frame. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff called the room to order as Judge Anthony Winters entered. A hush fell over the packed gallery. Docket number 2025, CR 1872, State versus James Mercer, the clerk announced, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. Over the next 2 days, jury selection unfolded with painstaking care. Both sides understood that finding impartial jurors in a case that had consumed the city for months would be challenging. Potential jurors were questioned about their views on law enforcement, racial bias, and whether they had already formed opinions about the case. "Have you seen the video of the incident?" Collins asked each potential juror. Most had. The challenge wasn't finding people who hadn't seen it. That was virtually impossible. But finding those who could set aside what they'd seen and judge the case solely on evidence presented in court. By the end of the second day, 12 jurors and 4 alternates were seated, a diverse group including a retired teacher, a nurse, a construction worker, a college student, and a grocery store manager. On the third morning, the trial began in earnest with opening statements. D.A. Parker approached the jury with measured steps. "This case is about trust," she began. "The sacred trust placed in those who wear a badge. Officer Mercer violated that trust when he pointed his service weapon at a young woman who had committed no crime and posed no threat." She paused, letting her words settle. "The evidence will show that this wasn't a split-second mistake made under pressure. It was the culmination of years of documented racial bias, finally caught on camera." When it was the defense's turn, Attorney Collins took a different approach. "Police work is complicated," he told the jury. "Officers make life-or-death decisions in seconds without the luxury of hindsight or slow-motion replay. Yes, Officer Mercer drew his weapon. Yes, he used language he shouldn't have used. But context matters. The evidence will show that he genuinely believed he was facing a potentially dangerous situation." The prosecution's case began with technical witnesses, the officers who responded to the scene, digital forensics experts who authenticated the videos, and the investigators who handled evidence. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a meticulous foundation for the case. On the fourth day, Officer Tom Chen took the stand, describing how he arrived to find Mercer with his weapon drawn on Zoe. "In your 15 years as an officer, have you ever drawn your weapon during a routine traffic stop?" Parker asked. "Only when there were clear signs of danger," Chen replied. "A visible weapon, threatening movements, or specific intelligence about the vehicle occupants. Never for someone simply questioning why they were pulled over." During cross-examination, Collins tried to establish that Chen hadn't seen the entire interaction. "You don't know what Officer Mercer might have perceived as threatening before you arrived, do you?" Chen shook his head. "No, but the body camera footage shows the entire encounter. There was nothing threatening about Ms. Bennett's behavior." The most powerful testimonies came from Mercer's fellow officers, reluctantly describing his history of racist comments and differential treatment of minorities. Officer Diane Reynolds recounted incidents where Mercer had refused calls from predominantly black neighborhoods or conducted unnecessary searches of minority drivers. "He once told me that Mayor Bennett was ruining our city by letting them take over," she testified, her voice barely above a whisper. When I asked who he meant by them, he used a racial slur. Throughout these testimonies, Mercer sat stone-faced, occasionally writing notes to his attorney. The jury watched him carefully, trying to reconcile the professional-looking man before them with the angry officer they'd seen in the videos. On the sixth day, former police administrator Grace Kelly provided damning testimony about the systematic burying of complaints against Mercer. "There were at least 20 formal complaints about Officer Mercer's treatment of minority citizens," she explained. "None received proper investigation. Most were simply made to disappear." Collins fought back during cross-examination. "Did you personally witness Officer Mercer engaging in misconduct toward citizens?" "No," Grace admitted. "But I saw the aftermath. I saw people come in upset and afraid after interactions with him. I saw their complaints vanish into thin air." The prosecution's digital evidence specialist presented the text messages recovered from Mercer's phone, displaying them on large screens for the jury. People in the gallery gasped at the casual hatred expressed in Mercer's own words. His specific threats about the Bennett family drew audible reactions from the jury. By the end of the first week, the prosecution had established a clear pattern of bias and misconduct stretching back years. But the most anticipated testimony was still to come. On Monday morning of the second week, Zoe Bennett took the stand. The courtroom fell completely silent as she was sworn in. Dressed in a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back, she looked both younger and older than her 19 years. District Attorney Parker approached gently. "Ms. Bennett, can you tell us what happened on the evening of May 15th? Zoe took a deep breath and began recounting the traffic stop in a clear, steady voice. She described her confusion when Mercer ordered her out of the car, her growing fear as his anger escalated, and the moment when he drew his weapon. "What went through your mind when you saw the gun pointed at you?" Parker asked. Zoe's composure wavered for the first time. "I thought I was going to die," she said simply. "I remember thinking about my parents, wondering if they'd hear about it on the news before anyone could call them." She paused, collecting herself. "I was terrified, but also confused. I couldn't understand what I had done to deserve having a gun pointed at my face." During cross-examination, Collins attempted to suggest that Zoe's status as the mayor's daughter had influenced the handling of the case. "Isn't it true that your father's position is the reason this incident received such attention?" he asked. Zoe met his gaze steadily. "No. This received attention because Officer Mercer pointed a gun at me during a traffic stop and used racial slurs. That would be wrong no matter who I was." She leaned forward slightly. "But I recognize that many people who experience police misconduct don't have videos go viral or get justice. That's why I'm here." Her testimony lasted nearly 3 hours, but not once did she lose her composure or contradict herself. When she stepped down from the witness stand, her quiet dignity had made a powerful impression on everyone in the courtroom. The defense case began the next day, with Mercer's attorney calling expert witnesses who testified about the dangers police officers face and the split-second decisions they must make. A use of force expert suggested that drawing a weapon could be justified if an officer perceived any potential threat. On the stand, Mercer's former supervisor, Lieutenant David Brooks, described him as a dedicated officer who never hesitated to take difficult assignments. "Did you ever witness Officer Mercer displaying racial bias in his work?" Collins asked. "Never," Brooks answered firmly. "He treated everyone the same way." On cross-examination, Parker was relentless. "You supervised Officer Mercer from 2015 to 2020, correct?" "Yes," Brooks replied. "During that time, 17 complaints were filed against him by minority citizens. Were you aware of those complaints?" Brooks shifted uncomfortably. "I was aware of some complaints, yes." "And what actions did you take to address this pattern?" After a long pause, Brooks admitted, "None specifically." On the trial's 11th day, James Mercer himself took the stand. His attorney had advised against it, but Mercer insisted on telling his side of the story. "Officer Mercer, why did you draw your weapon during this traffic stop?" Collins asked. "I felt threatened," Mercer said. Ms. Bennett was argumentative and reaching toward the passenger seat. "In that moment, I couldn't be sure what she was reaching for." "And the language you used?" Mercer looked down. "I lost my temper. It was unprofessional and wrong. I'm not proud of it." D.A. Parker's cross-examination was methodical and devastating. Officer Mercer, the body camera footage shows Ms. Bennett clearly stating she was reaching for her phone to record the interaction. "You can hear her say those exact words before you drew your weapon. Do you deny this?" "Things happened very quickly," Mercer hedged. "Yes or no, Officer Mercer, did Ms. Bennett tell you she was reaching for her phone?" "Yes," he finally admitted. "And is reaching for a phone to record police a crime?" "No." By the time closing arguments arrived on day 13, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. Both attorneys delivered impassioned final pleas to the jury. "This case isn't about attacking police," Parker concluded. It's about upholding the standards that good police officers meet every day. It's about ensuring that the power to detain, arrest, and use deadly force is exercised with responsibility and respect for every citizen. The jury deliberated for just over 27 hours across 3 days. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces gave nothing away. The forewoman handed the verdict form to the judge, who reviewed it silently before passing it to the clerk. On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of intimidation based on racial bias? Guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority? Guilty. As the verdicts were read, Zoe closed her eyes briefly, her mother's arm around her shoulders. Across the room, Mercer stood motionless, his expression blank as the reality of his future settled over him. The city of Westfield held its collective breath, waiting to see what sentence would follow, and whether this verdict might finally mark the beginning of real change. 2 weeks after the verdict, Westfield County Courthouse was again packed to capacity for James Mercer's sentencing hearing. The morning air felt heavy with anticipation as people filed through security. Some carried signs outside, a few demanding maximum punishment, others asking for leniency. Inside the courtroom, Judge Eleanor Martinez surveyed the crowd from her bench. At 62, she had presided over hundreds of cases in her career, but few had drawn this level of public attention or divided the community so deeply. Before we proceed with sentencing, she announced, I'll hear impact statements from those affected by these events. Zoe Bennett approached the podium first, a single page of notes in her hand. She looked different today, more confident than during her testimony, her voice steadier as she addressed the court. What happened to me lasted less than 5 minutes, she began. But those minutes changed everything. I still flinch when I see police lights. I still have nightmares about that gun pointed at my face. She paused, looking directly at Mercer. But I'm one of the lucky ones. My encounter was filmed. People believed me, many others haven't been so fortunate. Other community members followed, people who had filed complaints against Mercer over the years but never received justice. Fellow officers who spoke about the damage his actions had caused to public trust, and citizens who simply wanted to share how the case had affected their view of their own city. When all statements were complete, Judge Martinez called Mercer forward for sentencing. He stood with his attorney, shoulders slumped in his now familiar Navy suit. Mr. Mercer, do you wish to make a statement before sentencing? The judge asked. Mercer cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. He turned slightly to face the gallery. I want to apologize to Ms. Bennett. What I did was wrong. I let my temper and personal issues cloud my judgment. He paused, struggling visibly. I failed in my duty as an officer that night. I'm sorry. The apology fell flat in the silent courtroom. After 15 years of unchecked behavior, the words seemed hollow to many present. Judge Martinez folded her hands, her expression grave. Mr. Mercer, this court has considered many factors in determining your sentence. The jury found you guilty of serious crimes, crimes made more severe by your position of authority and the racial motivation evident in your actions. She continued, however, I must also consider that you have no prior criminal record. The question before me is what sentence will serve justice while acknowledging all relevant factors. The courtroom held its collective breath. James Mercer, for the crimes of assault with a deadly weapon, intimidation based on racial bias, and abuse of authority, I sentence you to 2 years in the state correctional facility. A murmur rippled through the room. Many had expected a much longer sentence, given the maximum possible 15 years. The judge raised her hand for silence. Additionally, you will serve 3 years of supervised probation following your release, complete 500 hours of community service, and permanently forfeit your right to serve in any law enforcement capacity. She leaned forward, her voice gaining intensity. Let me be clear about something, Mr. Mercer. This sentence may seem lenient to some, but it reflects a balance between punishment and the recognition that you are part of a larger system that failed. You didn't create the culture that protected your behavior, but you are being held accountable for your part in it. As officers led Mercer away, reactions in the courtroom were mixed. Some felt justice had been served, Others were outraged at what they considered a light sentence for crimes that could have ended Zoe's life. Outside, reporters thrust microphones toward Mayor Bennett, who had maintained a careful public neutrality throughout the trial, due to his personal connection. "I respect the court's decision," he said carefully. "But today's sentencing is just one step in a much longer journey for our city. The real work begins now, transforming the systems that allowed this to happen." That evening, the city council chambers overflowed during an emergency session called to address police reform. Residents lined the walls and spilled into the hallways, all wanting their voices heard. Council President Harriet Washington opened the floor. "Tonight, we're here to take concrete action. What happened to Zoe Bennett, and many others before her, demands more than words." For nearly 4 hours, citizens spoke passionately about their experiences and hopes for change. Then the council voted unanimously to establish the Westfield Independent Police Oversight Committee, comprised of civilian volunteers from diverse backgrounds with the power to review complaints, recommend disciplinary actions, and access police records. "This isn't about punishing good officers," explained Councilman Lee Thompson. "It's about creating accountability and rebuilding trust." The council also approved funding for mandatory bias training, body cameras for all officers, and a complete review of hiring and promotion practices within the department. Chief Wilson, who had been fighting for many of these changes since taking command, addressed the room. "These reforms are overdue and necessary, but I want to be honest. Policies alone won't fix everything. We need a cultural shift within our department, and that takes time and commitment." In the weeks that followed, Westfield became a case study in community policing reform. News programs featured the city's efforts, and police departments across the country sent representatives to learn from their experience. For Zoe, the trial's end brought complicated emotions. The media attention had disrupted her life, forcing her to withdraw from college temporarily, but it had also given her a platform and purpose she hadn't anticipated. "I never wanted to be the face of police reform," she told her therapist during a session, "but if sharing my story helps prevent this from happening to someone else, I need to do it." She began speaking at community events, helping people understand their rights during police encounters. Working with local youth organizations, she developed a program teaching young people how to safely interact with law enforcement, while advocating for better training for officers on interacting with teens. "This isn't about being anti-police," she often explained. "It's about creating a system where everyone feels safe, community members and officers alike." Across town at the state correctional facility, James Mercer adjusted to his new reality. Prison was a harsh awakening for a former officer. Most inmates kept their distance, viewing him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. He spent most days alone, working in the prison library, with plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had led him there. His first visitors were unexpected. His former partner, Officer Reynolds, and retired Officer Wilson, who had trained him years ago. "Why are you here?" Mercer asked, genuinely confused. Wilson, gray-haired and straight-backed despite his age, shook his head. "I failed you, James. I saw the signs years ago and did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my problem anymore after I retired." "You made your own choices," Reynolds added. "But the department failed too. We're all learning hard lessons from this." 6 months into Mercer's sentence, Westfield began seeing early results from its reforms. Complaints against officers had decreased significantly. More importantly, community surveys showed growing trust in the police, especially in neighborhoods that had historically reported negative interactions. The Oversight Committee, now fully operational, had already reviewed dozens of cases, recommending changes to policies and additional training where needed. They'd also highlighted exemplary officers whose community engagement could serve as models for others. Chief Wilson retired after 30 years of service, passing leadership to Deputy Chief Rivera, who had been instrumental in implementing the reforms. At her retirement ceremony, she reflected on the department's journey. "Crisis creates opportunity," she said. "Westfield faced a painful truth about bias in policing, but that truth has made us stronger. We still have work to do, but I'm proud of how far we've come." 1 year after the sentencing, Mayor Bennett organized a community reconciliation event in the city park. Food trucks, music, and activity booths created a festival atmosphere, but the purpose was serious, bringing citizens and police officers together for honest conversations about community safety and justice. At one table, Zoe sat across from a young officer named Kim Park, recently graduated from the academy. "What made you want to become an officer?" Zoe asked, "especially after everything that happened." Officer Park considered the question carefully. "Because of what happened. I saw how much damage one officer caused, but also how much good could be done when policing is done right. I wanted to be part of the solution." Nearby, children played basketball with off-duty officers. Community leaders chatted with police supervisors about neighborhood concerns. It wasn't perfect harmony. Tension still surfaced in some conversations, but it was a beginning. As the sun began to set, Mayor Bennett took the microphone briefly. "A community is tested not by whether it faces challenges, but by how it responds to them," he said. "Westfield is choosing to respond with honesty, accountability, and hope. This work isn't finished, it may never be, but today shows we're willing to do it together." The gathering continued into evening, people from all parts of Westfield sharing food, stories, and tentative steps toward a new understanding. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, it felt possible.